Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight for our exciting event with Shai DeLuca. My name is David Lviv. I'm a camera on campus, and we're excited that you're joining us, our camera fellow at the University of Florida and the Hasbara at York University for this amazing event with our speaker about progressive Zionism, LGBTQ rights, and social media activism. Before I introduce our moderator, Phoenix Berman from the University of Florida, our camera fellow, I just want to remind everyone that we're in webinar format and that you'll be able to submit questions for the Q&A function below. And that once Q&A starts, we'll be hearing questions from Phoenix and two student leaders from the Hasbara York Club as well. So that will start off our Q&A when we get to that point. But feel free to submit questions throughout the event. Without further ado, I'm excited to introduce Phoenix, our camera fellow at the University of Florida. Phoenix is an events fellow and is involved with organizations such as the EU Club and Chabad on campus. And she has done an amazing job along with York in planning this event. Welcome, Phoenix. We're excited to have this event.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming and sharing an evening with Shai DeLuca. As David said, I'm from the University of Florida and I'm events fellow, so I'm very excited for what's to come this evening. So I'd like to introduce Shai and give you a little bit of background about him. So Shai is an Israeli celebrity designer and media personality who made his mark on the North American scene when hired as an on-air design expert for Canada's longest-running and top-rated lifestyle show, Cityline. The show was syndicated in the US in 2017 and is now viewed in more than 70 million households across the US as well. Following his IDF service as a combat engineer, Shai entered civilian life as a decorated sergeant, retired. He's an outspoken advocate for Israel and has partnered within the organization Camera on Campus, a nonprofit whose mandate is to help students disseminate accurate information, about Israel on campuses around the world while sharing his personal story as an openly gay soldier in Israel's military.
Perfect. You guys hear me? All right. Thank you so much, Phoenix. I appreciate that. Guys, thank you so much for joining me tonight. I'm really excited to be here, of course, because part of this is York University, where I live here in Toronto. And, you know, it's close to home, so I'm happy to be here with you guys. Just to give you guys a little bit of, you know, kind of a background about what we're going to do tonight, I'm just going to give my story, tell you a little bit about who I am, why it is that I speak to progressive Zionism so, you know, feverishly, and of course, end with Q&A. And I think that's going to be my favorite part because I always love interacting with you guys. So just to start, you know, tonight's topic is really kind of focusing on progressive Zionism. And when we talk about progressive Zionism, for me, it's almost like you're doubling up on the same thing. I've never really kind of understood why people need to say progressive Zionism, because to me, Zionism is a progressive ideal. Think about it. Zionism is the indigenous rights of the Jewish people to return home and self-determine. You know, around the world, people are fighting for indigenous rights, for native rights for different peoples. So, you know, of course, Zionism has to be one of those progressive rights as well. Let's start off a little bit with who I am, my background and my story, and you'll kind of understand why it is that I like to speak to the progressive kind of sphere of this, because I feel as though my identity, who I am, really is progressive, or the progressive sphere certainly looks at who I am as a progressive, almost, except for when we get to Zionism sometimes. So my name is Shai DeLuca, and I always start with my name because DeLuca and Shai, people think that they're like, what? Those don't go together. One sounds very Italian, which it is, and one sounds Israeli. My story is actually an interesting one. So I was born to, you know, my parents, my mom, who knew her background, knew her history, our entire life, Jewish. My dad's story was a little bit more interesting. So my dad was actually born in southern Calabria, which is bordering Sicily. And he was born to a very poor, what he thought at that time was a Catholic family. You know, his parents struggled in the 50s in Italy. It was post-war. And they decided that they wanted to have a better life for their children. So they decided they were going to leave Europe and come to Canada, which is why I'm in Toronto now. The idea of my dad's story, and the reason that I like to tell this is because, like I say, he was born Catholic, but my dad tells, when he tells the story, and he loves to hear me repeat the story of his life, is that he always had this really interesting or strong yearning to understand more about the Jewish people. He never knew why, he didn't know where it came from, but it was always kind of this thing within him that he felt as though he really wanted to understand more about. Fast forward many years, my dad met my mom, and like I said, my mom was Jewish, and my dad, Catholic, started to go out with my mom, and they decided that they were going to get married. But as you can imagine, my grandparents, my mom's parents, Sephardi Jews, said, absolutely not, you are not marrying outside of Judaism. So my dad, at the age of 25, had to convert. He converted at the age of 25, and this is the part of the story of my dad's life that I like to tell because it just embarrasses him a little, so it's fun to tell. At the age of 25, as you guys can imagine, as every Jewish male has to do at 8 days old, my dad had to do at 25 in order to convert. Now, that was really kind of the kicker for my grandparents. Are like, all right, if you're going to do this at 25, you must really love her. You must really, want to be part of the Jewish people. So we're okay with that. Fast forward many years later, when DNA testing started to be like a thing and was really more popular, we in my family did our DNA testing because we knew my mom's side of the family, but we wanted to know more about my dad's side of the family. He didn't know much, and they didn't have many records. So when we did our DNA testing, it came out that my DNA was upwards of 90% Jewish. And we thought, well, that can't be right. There must be a mistake. And, at the beginning, these DNA tests were coming out. Some of them were novelty, some of them not. And we thought, let's do it again. We did 6 more, and all 6 came out exactly the same. So we decided to do a little bit of research, and we found out that, in fact, my dad is descendant of Jews that were banished from Spain after the Spanish Inquisition. And I tell this story because it really speaks to all these identities of progressive kind of ideals and values that make me up. I am a Jew, I am Sephardi, and I am LGBT. So I really speak to all these different ideals when it comes to progressive ideals, and yet always the one kind of pushback that I get from people is when I say, but I'm also very progressive and I'm a Zionist. And they say to me, well, how can that be? Zionism is not progressive. Of course it's progressive. Zionism is an indigenous rights movement, and I will go as far as to say the most successful indigenous rights movement of our time. Think about it. The most persecuted people in history, the Jewish people, finally, after thousands of years, are able to self-determine in our indigenous home. What's more progressive than that? So years later, of course, I had gone back and forth between Israel and Canada, and at the age of 18, I had to go into the army, like every Israeli does. When I was deciding what I wanted to do, of course, I wanted to do something that was going to give back to my community, back to my country, as much as I possibly could. And I decided I was going to go into combat engineering. So combat engineering, is a frontline position. It's, something that really puts you out there. And it is also a very male-centric, very macho-centric kind of sphere. So me, as an LGBT man, going into this, there were some questions maybe that I had, or some concerns that I had. But I will veer off for a second and talk about February 25th, 1996. And I go to this date because this date is really important to understand why it is then that I came out in the IDF. February 25th, 1996, I was invited to friends of mine, a family home in Jerusalem for Shabbat. I was at that time what's called a Chayal Boded, which is a lone soldier. My parents were not living in country, so I was allowed to, I had certain, certain perks, I guess you could call them, as a lone soldier. Things like certain, I was allowed to go home maybe earlier during holidays, a little bit more of a salary every month. A little, like teeny, but still, all these kind of perks as a lone soldier. And one of the things that a lot of the people in Israel, the community in Israel, does for lone soldiers is that they, want to have these lone soldiers come over for Shabbat or for holidays. I had family, but I had this friend whose parents wanted me to come, and they lived in Jerusalem. Now, I'm not a Jerusalemite. I'm a Moshavnik from the south. So I knew at that point as much about Jerusalem as probably, my American friends know about Washington, D.C., or have been to Washington, D.C. as much. And my Canadian friends as, Ottawa. So it's almost like, you go for school, you go, every so often, but it's not like a destination, if you will, for Israelis. February 25th, 1996, woke up that Sunday morning. My friend Avishai's mother, perfect Jewish mother, like all Jewish mothers, packed my lunch, did my laundry, sent me on my way. Now, because I'm not a Jerusalemite, I needed for her to explain to me where exactly I needed to go to get a bus. Guys, this was 1996. These things were not around. Phones were around, but not smartphones. So I had no idea where I was going. And she tried to guide me. I remember going downstairs and couldn't find where she had told me to go. The worst with directions. And I had asked somebody in the street and I said, where is this bus stop? So they had pointed actually to a bus that we saw and they said, catch that bus and it'll bring you to where you need to go. Ran, hit the back of the bus, Israel. The bus driver drove off. I laugh, but I shouldn't, because really that's what saved my life. About 100 meters ahead of me, that bus that I just missed, that I hopped on to get on, exploded. It was one of the buses that was hit by terror when that wave of terror was happening again in Israel. And I tell that story because that was a turning point for me in my life. It really made me understand that, had I been on that bus, nobody would have known who Shai was. Nobody would have known the truth about who I am, which is a lot of things, but also LGBT. And that to me was sad. And I decided that day that I really needed to speak to this. And I wanted to be able to share with, at that time, people who I considered family, who were the people that I served with. I needed to share that with them. But like I said at the beginning, guys, this is a combat role. This is a frontline role. This is a very kind of a macho atmosphere. How is it going to go over? In 1996, there was a lot in terms of, how far LGBT rights have come, but there was still some, uncertainties, and it wasn't as progressive as it is today. And we'll get into that shortly, but certainly, it was something that was a little bit of a concern to me. So I remember going that day to the base. I remember sweating buckets. It was the beginning of March, end of February, beginning of March, and it was still warm-ish in Israel, but I was sweating more than anything because I knew that day I was going to reveal to all these guys who I was, what I was. Got to the base, and as we did every Sunday, you put your bag down, and then the best way I can kind of describe what happens at the base when you get there on Sunday is like a locker room situation. It's very much about talking about, who you went out with on the weekend, what girls you went out on the weekend, what girls you met on the weekend. And it always came back to every Sunday, Shai. And Shai's always quiet, and Shai's always, I went to my aunt, I went to my cousins, I don't know, I was sick, I hung out, never really told anything. And for a lot of these guys who were really good friends of mine, in terms of the army way, Shai seemed like a very boring guy, but I really wasn't. Because of course, every weekend I was out with my friends, we were going to clubs, we were doing whatever, but these are things that I felt like I couldn't share. So this Sunday came around, and I remember sitting there, and everybody's going over their things. I went out with her, and I did this, and we went there, and we did all these cool things. And it comes back around to Shai, and Shai says, or they asked me, Shai, what did you do this weekend? Shai's response was quiet. And they looked at me and they thought, my goodness, of course they had known what had happened to me the week prior, and they wanted to make sure I was okay. Were you injured? Did something happen? Are you okay? Mentally, all fine. I just got really quiet, and I looked at them and I said to them, guys, there's something that I want to tell you. I don't know how to tell you. I feel as though I should have told you a long time ago, but I'm telling you now. I'm just worried about how you're going to take it. It got really quiet and I could see the concern in their eyes. And I just looked at them and I said, guys, I'm gay. And it got super quiet. And then in about 3 seconds, one of my best friends, a friend of mine who was sitting there, looked at me and he was like, why didn't you tell us? I have the perfect person to introduce you to. That was it. That was the whole big thing that I made up in my mind about how horrible things were going to happen to me because I was coming out in the army. And I tell that story because it really speaks to the progressive nature of what Israel is, even then. Nowadays, you look at Israel, and of course, Israel is a safe haven. Israel is a destination for so many LGBT people. I think one of the things that's kind of really important is to understand that even though we've come so far, we've come really far in terms of where we were as to where we are now. There's still a lot that we need to do. There are still things in Israel in terms of progressive values as an LGBT man that I'm still fighting for. There are, issues of surrogacy. There are issues of civil marriage in Israel. And these are still things that I'm fighting for. And I talk about those things as well, because I think it is dishonest not to talk about, when you're talking about the progressive nature of what the country Israel is. Think about it also, guys. Israel, where is it? It is in the Middle East, surrounded by some of the most non-progressive countries on earth. And there's this tiny little strip of land that is so progressive, and we've come far in 73 years. We're only 73 years old, guys. Think about America. You guys are almost 300 years old. Canada, 1867. So there are still many more years that allowed America and Canada to get to the progressive natures. Some of them, that gave that time. Israel only had 73, and this is where we are. So I tell that story because I think it's really important to understand that kind of progressive nature of what the country is, even then in 1996, surely where we are now. Now, after my Army service, I really decided that I wanted to do something that was going to give back to myself. I wasn't only, I had that experience with the bus bombing. I was injured during my service, and I spent almost a year in hospital. 3 of those months, I didn't know if I was ever going to walk again. So I had these things happen in my life that I really understood that I needed to live my life for me, and I wanted to do, what made me happy. If it came down to my parents and living, the life that they wanted, I'd probably be a doctor or a lawyer. Jews. But, I decided I wanted to do what I wanted to do for myself. And that was very much design and architecture. I always loved design and architecture. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to do for me. And I'm going to be able to give back to the world in adding beauty to the world in a different way. So this is something that I wanted to do. And I am type A personality, for those of you who don't know me yet. So, for me, when I was still in Israel thinking about where am I going to go learn, was it going to be in Paris? Because Paris is kind of like a design hub, or New York. And I don't speak French. No, not all Canadians speak French, guys. So I don't speak French. But I decided that New York was going to be my go-to. So I went to New York. I had $800 in my pocket, landed at New York, and I started school. I finished my degree. I graduated with honors. And after I finished studying design, I was offered a position by a company in La Jolla, California, to actually bring their design company up to Toronto. I didn't want to do that because my ideal always was I was going to finish my studies and go and start my studio in Israel. And that's what I wanted to do. So I went back to Israel first. I started my studio there. And that same company came back to me years later and said, listen, we still haven't done it. We'd still love for you to do this. At that point, I had already started what I was, my studio in Israel. It was up and running. So I said, that's fine. Let's leave it. I'm going to come to Toronto and do what I need to do. And that's a segue. I tell that part of the story because it's a segue into kind of where it brought me to where I am now. So in 2009, I was actually working as a designer and as an art consultant. And one of my clients, who is now like my brother, one of my dearest friends, said to me, you're really kind of great with people and you have this kind of charisma. Would you ever think about working on television? And I thought, yeah, we don't want to work on television. So did a screen test and the rest is history. In 2010, I started to work with what was then Canada's longest running television program, City Line, which is now syndicated in the US. Like Phoenix had said, it's seen across, I think, 70 million homes in the US. Don't ask me which channels, I couldn't tell you. But I do know that there are a lot of local channels. I told this story last time. I was in Arkansas when I was doing a speaking tour for camera, and this woman in Arkansas in the airport ran up to me, and it kind of caught me off guard because I don't know anybody in Arkansas. And she started screaming, Shai, Shai, Shai. I know you from the show. So I know in Arkansas it's seen. I know it's seen across the US as well. So once I started to do my interior design, and then I was now doing also on air interior design and fashion, it gave me this platform that I had never had before. It gave me this public platform that was just, you know, it extended to places that I would never be able to reach. And it was all done through social media, right? So now social media gives me this ability to reach people. But because of my public platform, I was able to reach a lot more people. In 2013, I had the opportunity, after 3 years, 3 whole years of Israeli chutzpah, coming to my producer, Chrissy, I love you, coming to my producer day in, day out, day in, day out, saying, listen, I want to take the show to Israel. I think there's just so much amazing things to be able to show in country. And I want to do it through the lens and through my eyes, through the eyes of a citizen. I don't want to talk about the politics. I don't want people to see Israel only through the lens of CNN or, you know, whatever. There's so much more to see. Finally, after 3 years, I ran her down and she finally agreed. And she said to me, listen, this is a gamble. She said, you know, we understand that you want to show it through this lens, but we also understand that there's a very political lens to what's happening there. So she said, this is a gamble, but it's your gamble. She said, if this goes off badly, it's coming down on you. So I was willing to take that gamble. I said, you know what? I am willing to do it. I know what I'm going to show, and I know that people are going to love what I'm going to show and leave the politics out of it. Luckily, we came back. Those shows were some of the highest rated shows ever of our entire show. And that was so heartwarming to me, because what it meant was what I was trying to do, kind of trying to show the progressive ideals of what Zionism has built in Israel, really paid off. It worked. When you see it, you know, for yourself, rather than reading what other people are saying or having that political spin that so many commentators put on it, you can understand how really forward-thinking it is. You know, think about it. When I was in the army with Israeli Arabs. I was in the army with, you know, ultra-Orthodox. I was in the army with Orthodox. And, you know, when I came out to all these people, and all these people accepted and loved me. In 1996, which was still, like I say, you know, it was still a little bit hard. Move forward to 2014. So for those of you who don't know or don't remember, 2014 was the year, of course, that Tzukei Ovda happened. Protective Edge, not Protective Edge, excuse me. Tzukei Ovda is where is the base where I serve. Protective Edge happened in Gaza, and that is the Gaza war. And it was the first time that I, now as this kind of public figure, this person who was on television, realized that I was going to have to start speaking about what was going on there, and publicly in kind of this larger audience, this kind of global larger audience. Well, I can tell you that that didn't go off well for me in terms of social media. So that was the first time that I really started to kind of present what was going on in Israel, why the war started, what the background was, and it got a lot of backlash that I guess I had expected. But one of the people who kind of threw it back at me, which was actually quite shocking, was a producer who she no longer works there. And let me preface by saying that my work has always been so supportive of me, so supportive of anything that I've ever done in terms of advocacy. So, you know, she was kind of a different one, and she really believed that, you know, things that I was saying were more propaganda. She was one of those people who were believing that, you know, Israel was always the wrong, Israel was always the enemy. And when this happened in 2014, she had posted something online about, I don't remember what the exact wording was, but basically she had said that it's a lie. If for those of you who don't remember, the reason that the war started was because 3 young boys were, of course, kidnapped by Hamas, murdered, and then discarded in the West Bank. What she posted was horrible. She posted basically that that was a lie. It never happened. It was Israeli propaganda. And that for me really kind of was the light switch that made me understand that, and she considered herself to be extremely progressive, probably one of the most progressive people that I had ever met in my life. And I thought to myself, you know, this really kind of speaks to why isn't then the idea of Israel defending itself progressive to so many people? And I reached out to her and I said to her, listen, you've now known me for 4 years. I'm probably the only Israeli that you know. When this happened, you didn't even take the time to call me and say, hey, Shai, I see you're posting something about this. You know, give me some background. What do you know about it? You know, maybe give me a different aspect of it than I know or what I'm seeing on the news. Never once did she ask to do that. Never once did she, think to reach out. And I understood at that point that it was going to be a job to really educate the progressive sphere about what Israel is, about what Zionism is, and about why Zionism is 100% a progressive value. So, this happened, of course, it went back and forth, and I hope I educated her. We don't work together anymore, but this really led me to kind of what I do now, in addition to doing, all the other things that I do in my career. So speaking to you guys, Israeli advocacy, in 2000, and I believe it was 2015 or 16, I was at a Camera on Campus event here in Toronto, and I had met at that time, who's no longer with Camera, but hi, Ben, if you're watching from Florida. I had met Ben, and he said to me, listen, we would love to actually have you come on and, speak and kind of tell your story. And that's where kind of this jumped off into what it is that I do, like with you guys today, and really speak to why it is that I'm doing what I'm doing. There is all this misinformation. There's so much misinformation about Israel, about Zionism, about, who the Jewish people are, about, what our ethnicity is, about what our religion is. So many things we can be talking about that if you took away the idea of Jews and Israel, always fall under progressives, kind of a progressive column. So think about it. Indigenous rights, progressive. Minorities, progressive. Ethnic minorities, progressive. All these things are progressive values that people fight for. And yet, when you add on Judaism or Israel, for some reason, all of a sudden that progressive kind of ideal dissipates. And it shouldn't. It shouldn't. We as the Jewish people, we as, a Jewish ethnicity, we as a Jewish religion, I think have taken, I don't think we've done enough in terms of reclaiming the term Zionism. Zionism is the indigenous rights of the Jewish people to self-determination in our homeland. It has become skewed to mean so many things that it's not. And I think it's really our job to take it back and make sure we take it back and not redefine, make sure that people understand what the true definition is, because it's our word. We define it. Nobody else gets to define it for us. We define it. Yes, progressive values are minorities define their indigenous rights movements. Minorities define, racism against them, which for Jews is anti-Semitism. These are all things that, progressive views, progressive values adhere to. So why not with Jews? That's when we get into anti-Semitism. So I don't want to talk about that. That's a whole other webinar, guys. We'll get into that maybe another time. But I tell all these things because what it does is it really explains the idea of progressive values, how it talks to or speaks to, Jews, Judaism, and Israel, and why it is that we need to fight and not be ashamed of the fact that, we are Zionists. That is a progressive ideal. Don't let other people define it for you. Don't let other people, skew it to mean something that you don't. Hold your head up high and say, yes, I'm a Zionist. You want to say progressive Zionist, that makes it easier for people to digest? Go for it. I don't feel the need to say it because I feel, and I want you guys to feel it in your hearts, whether you use it or not, feel that Zionism is a progressive value. Let's talk a little bit about social media. And then we're going to get to the fun part because I love Q&A with you guys. And I think that that's really where we get to, do some back and forth. And that's where the nitty gritty is. So I want to talk a little bit about social media activism because I think that that's one of the important things as well. In a world, especially during the pandemic, social media has really been our connector between different peoples, between different communities, between different countries for sure. And I think that, social media is a great tool. But it is also, it can also be it can be a hotbed of many things: racism, anti-Semitism, bigotry, homophobia. I mean, when you're standing behind a screen and, oftentimes people are faceless, people are very, open to say whatever they want. And that can be very, it can be very disheartening. It can sometimes make you feel like, oh, I can't do this anymore. But I will say this. I think social media is a great tool. And I think that, using social media to portray or to be able to discuss our ideals is a great one. Now, one of the challenges I know that a lot of people come back to me and say, oh, I spend hours on social media and it's just going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Let me tell you this, guys. You will never, ever change everybody's mind about Zionism or about Israel or about whatever. I say this, excuse me, to you, I say this to all the lectures that I do. You can only plant a seed. That's all you can do. You know, I'll give you a story and then we'll get to the Q&A. I was in Nottingham University doing a camera tour, and the university was set up in kind of like those old, it's in the UK, so it's those older universities that have that beautiful tiered theater with all those seats going up, and it was packed, it was full. And I remember for that lecture, there was this one young woman who walked in proudly with her big Palestinian flag, and the security came to me and said, "Do you want me to remove her?" And I said, "Absolutely not." I said, "She's the one that I want to be here. She's the person that I want to talk to." I mean, you know, I can talk to, of course, all of us and Jewish students, but we, you know, we're more connected or more on the same page, let's say, than, you know, someone like her might be. So I said, "Absolutely not. I want her to stay." She sat through the lecture. Of course, some of the things she asked were shocking that she actually thought that. But at the end of the lecture, she came down and she put out her hand and she said, "Listen, I don't agree with everything that you said. I probably, you know, won't repeat some of the things that you said." She said, "But," she said, "I appreciate the fact that you really kind of opened my eyes to a lot of things that I didn't know. I didn't know certain things about Gaza. I didn't even know about the disengagement of Gaza in 2005. I didn't know, you know, that Gaza is different than the West Bank, that it's almost two separate entities." There were certain things that she didn't know. So what I knew is that even though she walked out of there probably not thinking very different than when she walked in, the next time she goes and, you know, is in her group of friends or in her community and they're talking about Israel, she now knows something that is truthful rather than, you know, the rhetoric that maybe she was exposed to beforehand. So that was already a win for me, and I was already happy with that. I think that, you know, we have to be able to accept our small wins and not be so distracted by the fact that, you know, we're not getting those big wins. I was that person. I told you guys at the beginning, I'm type A personality. I used to think, I'm going to go on these camera tours, I'm going to walk into these university students and walk out and everybody's going to be Zionist. Everybody's going to be raising Israeli flags. That's going to be great. Not the case, but that's okay. That's okay. My job is not to change your mind. My job is to give you a different perspective and allow you to kind of let you sit with that. And the next time that you have a conversation with somebody who says something about how unprogressive Zionism is or how about bad Israel is, you've heard a different side to it. You can make up your own mind and not just listen to the one side. So guys, I know that I'm cutting into Q&A time, so I'm going to throw it back to Phoenix. Thank you so much, and let's hear your questions, guys.
Thank you so much, Shai, for your wonderful narrative and your history. We absolutely loved learning more about you and what you stand for. So one of the questions that I would like to start off our discussion with is, when we look at this era of progressivism and kind of making sure that we have a diverse society that really values, you know, progressive values, one of the things that we come across is cancel culture. And I'm wondering, in your own career field, have you ever been faced with anyone on social media attempting to cancel you for your support for Israel, your stance on Zionism, and kind of how your identity intersectionalizes with you know, your LGBTQ identity and your identity as like a Zionist and a Jew?
Yes.
At that.
Absolutely. So thank you for that question. I think it's a great question because I am not a proponent of cancel culture. I don't agree with it. I don't see the added value in canceling somebody if I can educate them instead. And I think that Nick Cannon is a great example of that. For me personally, I think that, yes, I have. And, you know, we're speaking to York University students. So I know that, you know, some of you guys are here in Toronto. And I know some of you guys know the story of what I am going through right now. A year ago, a business here in Toronto who is now facing 5 different lawsuits from various Jewish organizations and human rights organizations, had taken my picture and posted it on her Instagram feed for her business and said that I was a terrorist and that I sniped Palestinian children. That, of course, was a lie. So, you know, long story short, she decided that she wasn't going to stop doing what she was doing, and there is a lawsuit pending with her now. I say that because after this lawsuit was started, through my show, I went on so I am on Cityline and Breakfast Television. Breakfast Television is kind of the morning show. Cityline is a more lifestyle show. Breakfast Television is almost a news show. I was on the news show talking about the lawsuit and kind of what I was facing. And what she did was she watched it. And what she did was she went to all of her followers after saying that not only did I not deny that I was a terrorist and I sniper Palestinian children, they should all go to Cityline and try to cancel me. Now, I am, like I said before, I'm very lucky. I have a very supportive, a group of people that I work with. My bosses are all supportive. Of course, I had never done anything that would require me to be canceled. I've never been racist. I've never been xenophobic. I've never been anti-Palestinian. Of course, these are things that people throw out because I support Israel, which is where, a lot of the issues lie. People always say, if you support Israel, you're anti-Palestinian. That's ridiculous. You can support both people's, rights. So for her to then go on and then try to have people cancel me, yes, she tried. She failed, but she tried. At the end of the day, I was lucky. I was lucky. A lot of people might not be as lucky. A lot of people might not have had the strength that my boss had to say, hold on, we don't believe what you're saying. We know what he does. We know what he speaks about. So yes, I have faced it. No, I don't agree with it. And I wouldn't even agree. To her, I know she feels as though what I'm doing is trying to cancel her. I'm not trying to cancel her. I would never want her to, lose her business. I'd never. What I want is for her to be educated. What I want is for her to understand, why what she did was wrong. Some people, like I said before, guys, I'm going to win sometimes. I might lose some. But yeah, so I've definitely faced it.
One of the questions that we can kind of segue from that topic is, how do you deal with anti-Semitism and Israel hates or anti-Israel biases that you see online and on social media?
Okay, so I think, the anti-Israel biases or anti-Israel kind of commentary, most of it that I see online is very much rooted in anti-Semitism. I know there is this kind of, I don't know if it's an ideal or what we'll call it, is that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. I disagree with that. I think it's absolutely anti-Semitism. If we understand Zionism to be the right of the Jewish people to self-determination, to say that you can't have that is, of course, anti-Semitic. So, oftentimes what I get, in terms of anti-Israel vitriol online is very much rooted in anti-Semitism. And when I expose that, when I break it down and I peel away the layers of that onion, and people realize that person who's done it might, be steadfast and say, absolutely not. I don't care. I'm against Israel, not against the Jewish people. It might not be about that specific person. What I will tell you guys is remember, when you're online, it's not only the person that you're interacting with, it's all the people who are reading and watching what you're saying. So you might not get to that person, and I'm going to fight that person in my words, but it might not be about that person. People who are going to read it are going to be, oh, okay, all right. I see what he answered. I see what the answer is. I see, so I never back down from somebody who says something anti-Israel or anti-Semitic. I will give the information. I will give the facts. It might be, it might change their mind. I might not, but keep in mind, guys, when you're fighting that anti-Israel vitriol, remember, it's not only the person you're fighting, it's the people who are reading it as well. So keep that in mind.
Thank you so much for answering. My name is Tamar Moyal, and I'm one of the co-presidents of the Hasbara group at York, along with my colleague Seth, who's on the call as well. And on behalf of everyone, we really just want to thank you for taking the time and being so informative and really letting us all know of the back end of what it's like. So our question is, being part of the LGBTQ plus community, how have you noticed shifts in perception and I guess representation of LGBTQ plus in Jewish and Israeli circles within the media?
That's an excellent question. Thank you for it. And thank you so much for having me. We've come a long way. We've come a long way. I think the idea of intersectionality is a challenging one. I mean, I get what the idea behind it is, but I don't necessarily always agree that everything can intersect, because I think that creates some problems. I mean, I think, my identity as an LGBT person is separate, but the same as my identity as Shai, as a Zionist. You know, so all these things make up who I am, but they don't necessarily all intersect. You know, I can look at my identity as an LGBT, you know, Jew, and I can say, I understand that Judaism looks at, you know, maybe Orthodox Judaism looks at LGBT issues and says, no, that doesn't sway me. It doesn't make me feel as though I'm not then part of the Jewish community. You know, Israel, absolutely. Like Israel, I think is probably, if you want to go pro-intersectionality, I think is probably one of the best examples of what true intersectionality can look like in terms of being Israeli and LGBT. I mean, Israel is the only country in the Middle East that has, you know, equal rights for LGBT people. You know, and I think that that's something that we should all be proud of. With all the things that we still need to work towards, that is something that we should definitely be proud of. So I would say that don't, you know, don't always try to make that intersection. It's okay if you can't, and it's okay if you are LGBT and it can't intersect with Judaism. That's okay. You know, it's okay if you're Jewish, but you can't intersect with, I don't know, whatever else. It's okay. You can have distinct and separate identities without them intersecting and then still being all, you know, they can all work together.
Right. Thank you so much for that.
Sure.
Hi, thank you so much, Shai. We're really grateful to have you with us here tonight. I thought it was very empowering to hear on your stance on Zionism, especially as a Jew in the diaspora, such as myself. It's really easy to internalize damaging messages in media, so it's definitely very powerful to hear from a fellow Jew who lives nearby as well. So just a question our group had was, do you have any tips for Canadian students, especially for trying to convey their pro-Israel sentiment on campus, especially if they've never done it before?
Absolutely. So I think that just because of the rhetoric that kind of surrounds being, and you and I, we all use it. We use the term pro-Israel. I mean, for me, it's like, it's kind of like a double-edged sword, because of course we're pro-Israel, but what does that really mean? I mean, you know, are we like pro-Canada? Are we, you know, so it's always like Israel is put on this separate kind of thing. So when I want to advance Israel or advocate for Israel, I think that one of the greatest strengths that certainly the students from Cameron campus, the Cameron campus fellows are like experts at this, is allyships. So, you know, in all the university campuses that I've visited, it's been so wonderful to see the Cameron campus group or the, you know, whatever Jewish groups are on campus intersect with maybe LGBT groups or whatever other people have, you know, BIPOC groups. We did something with a BIPOC group once in New Orleans. It was absolutely amazing. And what that does is, it opens the door organically to other people being able to see how your group or what you stand for really connects to what they're standing for too. And it doesn't do it in a preachy way. It does it in a, you know, we're doing an event. We need to understand what you're doing or what you stand for in order that this event works. I want to learn what you stand for. And then we see those commonalities. You know, we might not agree on everything the same, but when we get those commonalities, it kind of puts people's guards down, and all of a sudden you can have these conversations. And it's all about conversation, right? So if you can, you know, pair up with other organizations or other clubs or whatever it is on your university campuses in order to be able to, you know, promote what you want to promote organically, I think that that's a win-win, because it helps the other group, it helps the pro-Israel group, but it creates these bonds in commonality that a lot of people don't know that these groups have.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Sure.
One of the things that you touched upon earlier in your discussion was your advocacy for surrogacy and also your views on civil marriage. And I wondered if you could kind of expand upon your opinions and your views on that. I think it would be a great opportunity for discussion.
Sure. So, you know, like I say, you know, LGBT rights in Israel are very progressive. You know, there's still some things that we need to work on, though, and we have to be honest about that. So one of the things is surrogacy laws and civil marriage. So in Israel right now, I will say that the marriage laws in Israel are not anti-LGBT, they're anti-civil. So what does that mean? Nobody in Israel can get married unless they marry under a religious umbrella. So whether it is Judaism, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, whatever, it has to be a religious ceremony. And that is why LGBT people can't marry, because none of those religions yet allow gay marriage. So it's very important that when we talk about gay marriage in Israel, we're honest about the fact that it's not necessarily specific against gay people, it is against non-religious ceremonies. I am very much a proponent of having civil marriage in addition to religious ceremonies in Israel, because that has to be, that's the only way of the future. There are people in Israel who are Jews, who are atheists. There are Jews who, don't want to have a religious ceremony. There are Jews who want to marry somebody who's not Jewish. And, it goes for Islam as well as Christianity. And of course, they all have their own rules. But speaking, about Judaism, because, that's what I know, it's a challenge. And the challenge is there, and we're almost there. We're almost there. We're almost, at that doorstep of civil marriage. But there's this pushback from kind of the religious, for those who don't know, the Rabbanut or the Rabbinate, it kind of sits on top, and that is the only laws in Israel that are religious laws are marriage, death, and divorce. Marriage, death, and divorce. Everything else are civil laws. We are a civil, secular country. Civil marriage will help with so much. I, as a gay man, can get married outside of Israel, and my marriage is recognized in Israel, which is extremely progressive. No other country in the region certainly recognizes gay marriage. The challenge with that is as amazing as that is, if for whatever reason, a gay man or gay woman needs to get divorced at some sort of point in their life, the problem is they can't get divorced in Israel. They then have to go back to wherever they got married and then get a civil divorce. So it creates these kind of challenges that are unfair and put certain Israelis at a disadvantage than others. And that should never be. In a progressive society, everybody is equal. And as we're almost there. We're not almost there, but we're not quite. So we have a little bit of work to do. In terms of surrogacy laws, and this was kind of in the news a couple of years back, surrogacy laws in terms of LGBT peoples in Israel are antiquated. People in Israel, a straight couple, a heterosexual couple, are allowed to hire a surrogate and a surrogate for children. LGBT people or same-sex couples cannot. So the challenge with that is they can, however, hire a surrogate outside of Israel and then bring the child back to Israel, and the child is Israeli. But as you can imagine, and I have friends who did this, it is extremely expensive. They spent almost $500,000 US to have a child for the same right that, anybody else can have in Israel if they're not same sex. So, it should be everybody. So what that does then again is it says, okay, you as an LGBT person can have children if you're very, if you have the money to do it. Unfair. So this is something we still need to work on, something we still need to, push forward. There are ways to work around it. I see friends now, there's something called Horot Mishutefet, which is like co-parenting. So, an LGBT man and let's say an LGBT woman or a straight woman, friends, can do in vitro, and under the law, there it's co-parented, meaning that both are equal parents under the law. But there are, it shouldn't be that I should have to choose a different path when my neighbor can have an easier path. So that's why I say, with all the progressive values that we have achieved, with all the amazing strides that we have made, there still are things that we need to work towards.
Thank you so much for your thoughts. I'd also like to ask you, this comes from an anonymous attendee. The person says, "Hi, Shai. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how progressive Zionists can best build authentic inroads with other progressives and other minority communities."
Yes. So much like I said beforehand, I think it's these allyships. I think it's the organic nature of, if the other progressive communities can really and truly take the time to understand why Zionism is progressive, then I think that organic kind of commingle is really where your success is going to be. So, creating events that, bring these groups together, looking at the commonalities, don't look at what's different, look at what's the same. Let's say, for example, BIPOC groups, yeah? So people of color, indigenous peoples, Jews are indigenous people. One of the greatest events that I ever did was with a good friend of mine, an indigenous American. Manny, if you're watching, hi. Great guy. He's a Zionist. He lives in the US. He speaks for Israel. And the reason that he does it is because he understands that Jews are fighting the same indigenous battle that he fights in America. So if you can get those understandings, those kind of commonalities, and not look at what's different, first look at what's the same, you're going to succeed. You're going to do great. And you can work out those other things after, but get those commonalities in first.
Thank you so much. Now transitioning into a much more, I think, topic we haven't really discussed yet, and that's kind of the government and politics. So someone asks, you discuss progressive Zionism. As Israel enters a fourth election cycle, do you believe the country is heading towards a more progressive or conservative path?
My goodness, that is...
I know it's loaded.
Let me tell you something. I mean, you're asking an Israeli that question right before the election. How much time have you got? Okay, so, it's a hard one. I know just by the sheer numbers that there is more than 50% of Israelis are progressive in terms of who they might vote for. What people fail or sometimes don't think about is that the number one thing that Israelis vote for before anything else, myself included, the most progressive of progressive Israelis included, is of course security. And the reason is because if we don't have the security, we don't even need to talk about anything else because we won't be there. So the challenge in Israel is really finding a candidate that can speak to the security, but then also speak to the other things as well. Now, of course, we are in a much better situation than we were, in 1948. We have one of the strongest militaries in the world. We have the best intelligence in the world. So we don't have to be as astute when it comes to, being so always talk about security. However, that's the number one thing. And I say that because sometimes the election comes out and people say, well, I thought, you said Israelis are progressive. And I say, yes, but who on the other side, like which of the other candidates can speak to the progressive values, but also guarantee the security? And I think that many, I don't want to diss any of the candidates, but I think what a lot of candidates don't do well is push back on the rhetoric that Bibi gives in terms of what he promises in security. He's done a great job for security. You can't lie about that. And he concentrates on that. And that fear is still ingrained in so many Israelis. So, oftentimes they'll say, I'm willing to not worry about the other things. I just had a conversation the other day. Actually, this is a great question, because I just had a conversation the other day with a follower of mine in Israel. She's wonderful. She's a friend of mine. She's Orthodox. She lives in Judea and Samaria. And she said to me, I'm going to vote for Smutrich, which is like they're Kahanists. If you guys know what Kahanists are, they're very racist, very right-wing, very homophobic. And I said to her, how can you even put that out there? And she said to me, listen, she said, I know all these things that you're saying are true. She said, but for me, the important thing is my security here in Judea and Samaria. And I couldn't say anything back to her other than I get it. And as much as hard as that is for me as an LGBT man to say, I get it. So, I think that what I would hope that more of the candidates who are central or centrists in Israel would do is say, listen, we know the security is the issue, but we can do these same things and not have to worry about, giving up on other things. The other thing that I want people to realize and understand is elections in Israel are very different than Canada. So we have coalition governments there. You cannot, one party is elected, but that one party has to make up enough seats, a majority, in order to be able to, well, I guess it's the same as in Canada, the majority in order to be able to be the ruling party. The problem is unlike in Canada where we have 3, maybe 4 parties, in Israel, I don't even know how many there are now. I mean, it's almost seems every other day there's a new party coming out. And when all these smaller parties, especially the ultra religious parties, or the Rishima Mishutefet, which is the Arab party, which is extremely anti-LGBT. The problem is these smaller parties that in any other normal kind of situation would not have representation. The government that gets the closest to the majority said to them, come and be with us, and then we'll be the governing government. So what that does is it gives a voice to people who otherwise would never have a voice because they don't have the actual vote numbers. And that is a challenge in Israel that we're going to need to work with. And I do not think it's going to happen under the current administration, because he is, of course, enjoying the fact that this is happening. It's going to happen when a new prime minister comes in and kind of realizes that it can't work like this anymore, because exactly like you said, we're going to the 4th election now. P.S. by the way, guys, for all of you who say Israel is not a democracy, 4 elections, I mean, that's a democracy. So, but it's a challenge, and it's a challenge that Israelis grapple with day in and day out, and it's something that we need to change in our system.
Thank you so much. We have a question coming from another anonymous attendee, and this is tying more to, let's say, the discussion on Jewish ties to the land. So someone says, how can we advocate for a progressive side of the conversation when Israel is often conflated with colonialism and white supremacy and seen as the aggressor?
Well, I mean, all we have to do is use facts. Our greatest weapon in our arsenal is facts. Jews are not colonists. Jews are indigenous to the land. You cannot colonize land that you're indigenous to. That would be like saying to a Native American, you're a colonist because you were born in Europe. There is this ideal that is given to Israel or Jewish people that is not given to anybody else in the world. If my Native American friend moved to Europe and married somebody and had children there and grandchildren, their grandchildren would, and they were all indigenous Native Americans, those grandchildren would still be indigenous Native Americans. It doesn't change. It doesn't take away your indigeneity. So, I think that when people are talking about, progressive values, indigenous values are very much part of it. Indigenous Jewish values are very much part of it. Sorry, the other part of that question was?
Yes. So they're saying, how do we advocate for a progressive side of the conversation when Israel is often conflated with colonialism and white supremacy? And seen as the aggressor.
Okay, so white supremacy. I mean, when people say to me Israel is white supremacist, I laugh and I cry, because Jews are the victims of white supremacy. We are victims of white supremacy. We're not white supremacists. I realize that a lot of Jews are white passing, or I guess the term is white passing. We seem fair. I'm a Sephardi Jew. I have blue eyes and I seem fair, but I'm a Sephardi Jew. So I tell people I'm a Sephardi Jew, and all of a sudden they see me more as a Jew of color. Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, we're Jewish people. The Jews as an ethnic group are all one, and we are victims of white supremacy. The Holocaust is the best example of that. So I absolutely fight back anybody who says Jews are white supremacists. We can't be historically. Historically, we have always been the victims. And the oppressors, or the challenge that's going on right now in Judea and Samaria is a challenge. It is a challenge, and we have to be honest about that. Gaza's less of a challenge in terms of what I feel, because we disengaged, in 2005. Judea and Samaria is very different. I say to people this: Judea and Samaria is not it's not colonized land. It's certainly not occupied land. And that's important, because I want to talk legally and not what people feel. Occupation, in order for the term occupation to adhere, it talks about a sovereign people or a sovereign piece of land that was then occupied by an occupying power. The land that we're talking about was never sovereign. It is disputed land, and that's really important. That is the terminology that I would hope, I implore on you guys to use, rather than saying occupied. It is disputed. It is disputed because A, it was never sovereign. B, when Israel gained control over it, was gained over from Jordan, that was not the legal owner of the land. So, it's not occupying and it's not oppressing. Are people in the West Bank not living the lives perhaps that they should, or the best lives that they can? Of course. But this is the result of poor Palestinian government. This is the result of years of the Palestinian Authority taking money from international aid, billions of dollars, and look at the houses that the Palestinian leadership, or Hamas leadership, the Hamas leadership lives in Turkey and Qatar in mansions. People in Gaza don't have water. The Palestinian Authority live in this, beautiful homes that I wish I could afford. The people in the West Bank, horrible lives, you know? And so let's be honest about where the oppression or where the despair comes from. Yes, does some of it have to do with that we still have not figured out what to do with the disputed land and there still has not been a peace agreement? Absolutely. But I throw that back at the Palestinian Authority also, and I say, listen, guys, you guys had every opportunity, time and time and time again, to accept a peace agreement. You never have. I'm not going to accept something that's going to make me less safe simply because the authority and, you know, the people who are sitting at top, you know, they're sitting back and they're comfortable. It doesn't bother them. The people who are suffering are the people. So when you talk about those things, you talk about oppression, be honest about it and say, yes, you know, people are living lives that aren't the best lives, but let's understand why.
Thank you so much, Shai, for joining us this evening and sharing your experiences with us. It's definitely helped a lot of students from the Canada all the way down to Florida to be educated more on the issues you've discussed. And so we would like to pass it on to David.
This was an incredibly amazing event and a lot of fantastic questions. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. We hope you have a great evening and a great weekend.